Okay, just to let y'all know, I am starting the webinar so that people can get settled in. Hi, everyone. I'm going to let people keep joining here, and we'll get started right at 2 o'clock. Hi, everyone. I have 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started as people join us. I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for our last Congressional Management Foundation session today. I want to thank all of you guys for being here, especially after this New Year break. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday break. For a recap of all of the information that we've learned the past few months, we've discussed why it's important to build relationships with our legislators and their staff. We've also been able to find some details on how we can move the needle with our elected officials by sharing our stories, as well as getting effective strategies that we can use to engage, how to build relationships back home. Today, we're going to be exploring some of the ways that we can have successful meetings, what to do before, during, and after meetings with our legislators, which will be super important, seeing as our 87th legislative session is about to kick off next week. As y'all know, we've been hosting these trainings since August, so I hope y'all are no strangers to Brad and Seth here joining us today. So as a quick recap, Seth is the Director of Citizen Engagement for Congressional Management Foundation, and he has served in national nonprofit organizations as public policy and an advocacy professional, and currently directs advocacy and training initiatives for CMF, including their Partnership for a More Perfect Union. We also have Brad Fitch, who is the President and CEO of Congressional Management Foundation, where he has spent 25 years in Washington as a journalist, congressional aide, college instructor, entrepreneur, writer, researcher. He's done it all. We have a lot of knowledge to learn from them, and I want to thank y'all both so much for being here and leading these trainings for us the past few months. We've had so many great comments on the information that y'all are providing for our members. And as a reminder for y'all, if you have any questions throughout the session, please type them into the Q&A or the chat, and Brad and Seth or Texas Realtor staff will be happy to answer them at the end of the session. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jen. Again, we're delighted to be back here to be talking to the Texas Realtors about before, during, and after meetings with lawmakers. As you know, we are the Congressional Management Foundation, and so a lot of our research is based on the federal Congress. But many of the lessons and many of the research that we have done is definitely applicable at the state level. So as you think about preparing for your virtual meetings and your virtual fly-in during March, that we know is going to be your time to have your meetings with lawmakers, keep in mind that the general principles of having good, successful meetings with elected officials go all through the spectrum of the governmental process, whether you're talking about federal legislators, state lawmakers, or local. Some of the logistics are different and some of the tactical things are different. And we'll talk about that if you're working with a Texas lawmaker as opposed to a U.S. senator who may have, Senator Cornyn may have over 80 or 90 staff members. That's going to be different than if you're dealing with a Texas state senator. But some of the practical things that you learn about in interacting with lawmakers, and especially how you follow up with lawmakers, it really runs the gamut. So we're going to walk you through what we've learned in working with Congress and what we've learned in talking to congressional staff. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Seth Turner, who at this point is going to kind of walk you through the different types of feelings you might be experiencing right now as you get ready for these meetings. Seth, take it away.
Well, thanks, Brad. I've done a number of trainings for people getting ready to prepare or getting prepared to meet with their members and policymakers. And traditionally what I've observed in the audience is people kind of fall into sort of four categories. So, the first category of people is when I'm talking to and training people to prepare them for their meetings is this category right here. These are the people that are just serving the Kool-Aid, or they're drinking the Kool-Aid that I'm serving. They can't wait to get up there. Oh yeah. Kind of to go out on the Hill and have those meetings with their policymakers. But another group is this group right here. It's the people that are on the fence. They're really not sure whether or not their participation and their engagement with their policymakers is really going to make much of a difference at all. They're kind of in the wait and see mode. And then you've got this group right here. This is the people who they basically kind of checked out. They're usually in the back of the rooms checking their cell phones. They're not listening because they have absolutely no belief at all. They're completely cynical, and they just don't believe that their voice and their participation is really going to make any difference. It's just unfortunate that they're there because their boss, I guess, sent them there or something like that. So they're kind of just checking the box there. And then lastly, you have this group right here, the group that is just looking at this this opportunity to meet with a member of Congress like a deer looks into headlights. They're absolutely terrified. They don't feel like they're prepared at all for their meeting. So as you kind of go into this, think about what category it is that you fall into. And hopefully, we'll be able to kind of address some of your concerns and some of those attitudes that you have about meetings with your policymakers. One thing that I would note, though, is this, is that members of Congress and congressional staff, having a meeting with a member is one of the most, in fact, is the most influential thing that you can do when it comes to engaging with a member of Congress. And we know that because we asked this question in a survey over the course of more than a decade. We asked it in 2004, 2010, and then again in 2015. And the question goes like this: if your member or senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And when we asked that question throughout that decade, we basically got the same data. I see there that, from 99% down to 94% from 2004 to 2015. But considering that we work with such a small sample size when we're surveying congressional staff, that's kind of a statistical, it's not statistically significant. But what you see here is that, almost 100% of the congressional staff that responded to this question believe that meetings with constituents, in-person visits with constituents, have some or a lot of influence in their decision-making process. So I hope that kind of addresses some of the concerns and maybe some of the attitudes, the cynicism out there in the audience that may be there. So let's kind of go over what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like on Capitol Hill. We're going to do just a kind of quick overview about what it's like to be a staff or a member of Congress on Capitol Hill. We're also going to talk about things that you can do to prepare for your meetings with elected officials. And then also we have some research on meetings specifically. And I know that there were even some questions in advance on people wanting to know sort of the do's and don'ts of what to do in a meeting. And so we also have some tips that we will cover on tips that you can follow in order to ensure that your meetings are conducted effectively. And then lastly, I know Joanna already mentioned this, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the program. Frankly, it's a lot easier for us to address questions, sort of when the slide's still up and it's a kind of a more of a relevant time, rather than it is for us to wait all the way until the end. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to cover them as we can throughout the program. Okay, so let's jump into the meat of the program with life on Capitol Hill. What's it like to work or be a member of Congress? And so a lot of people, when they think about that question, an image like this kind of comes to mind, something from like House of Cards. And so here's a typical scene from House of Cards with our friend Frank Underwood, who's kind of a seedy politician who ended up unfortunately being played by an even seedier actor named Kevin Spacey. And he's sitting in this pretty cush office, some dark paneling, cushy seats. Looks like they're sipping on some single malt scotch, maybe, kind of enjoying a laugh with the kind of the inside cronies there, right? Looks like a pretty cushy gig, doesn't it? But here, that's Hollywood's portrayal of a Capitol Hill office. Here's the real deal. This is Congressman Mike Quigley. And what's he doing there? He is throwing a mattress down on the floor of his office. Why is he doing that? Well, Mike Quigley, he represents a suburban district of Chicago. And frankly, I don't know about you and your realtors, you ought to know this. Living in Chicago, maintaining a residence in Chicago is a pretty expensive proposal there. And so is maintaining a residence in Washington, D.C. And so a lot of members of Congress have taken to just, sleeping on the floor of their office on Capitol Hill rather than, trying to maintain an office. Others just frankly don't want to get in a cab at the end of a really long day. They work long hours, usually, from sunup until sundown and afterward. And so a lot of members just, frankly, they're too exhausted and they just don't want to get in the cab and schlep to some kind of bland hotel. Now, this isn't necessarily something that as a Congressional Management Foundation, when we provided advice to staff and members of Congress, is not something that we advise them to do, but it is the reality there. And the average number of meetings that a member of Congress has is 13 meetings a day. So you can see it's a pretty long day that they experience on Capitol Hill. So that covers members of Congress, but let's talk about staff. And here's a pretty typical picture of staff at work on Capitol Hill. These staffers are prepping for what appears to be a committee markup, where they're getting ready to kind of literally take pen to paper and mark up legislation. And you can see that it looks like they put up a few all-nighters in there, making sure that all the amendments and everything that's been filed, or everything's in accord, is filed accordingly and in order. You've got that one young woman down there on her knees, kind of pouring through all the paper in those boxes. They also work really long hours, and frankly, also, they work in pretty tight, cramped quarters. I often tell people that if you have issues with, like, say, personal space, definitely working on Capitol Hill is a really poor professional choice because their offices are really, really cramped. And I said before, they work really, really long hours. The average number of daily meetings by a House office is 28 meetings a day. And then also something happened, I think we've covered some of this before, but I'll just kind of refresh your memory on this, is that something happened in the early 90s, or in the 90s and early 2000s, that really made their days even longer. And that's that the internet was invented, and correspondence between constituents and congressional offices really exploded during the decade between 2002 and 2010. As the internet was invented and those emails came in, and they really do struggle to kind of keep up with keeping up with the volume of answering the mail from constituents. That's one of the biggest priorities. It's often one of the ways that congressional offices are measured in terms of their performance is, how backlogged is the mail and how quickly can they respond to mail. So it's really important. They really do make an effort to try to keep up with this volume. But as you can see here, the amount of congressional mail that came from constituents in between the years of 2002 and 2010 increased between 200 to a 1,000% increase in the average House office. So that goes up to about 2010, and we know that this trend continues on. And I have some anecdotal information I can show you on that, and that's this right here. So we got data from one House office that serves kind of the metropolitan, in a district kind of in the metropolitan DC area. And they shared data from 3 years, from 2001, 2011, and 2017. And so in 2001, what they received was about not even 10,000 emails from constituents that year. But 10 years later, that number had grown to almost 50,000 emails and letters from constituents. And by 2017, that number had increased 13 times the amount since 2001 to almost 125,000 emails in that year alone. And so it's you can just see that that trend continues as and Hill staff really do struggle to keep up just with the volume of mail that they receive. But here's something that's interesting, and it's really important to keep in mind when you're thinking about getting ready for meetings with people who work on Capitol Hill, and that's staffing. You may not realize this, but the number of staff, full-time staff in the House, has actually been capped at 18 staffers. The House office cannot employ more than 18 full-time staff at any given time, and that was actually done. That cap was put in place in the year of 1974 as part of a kind of a budget cutting effort. And so, but let's just kind of put 1974 into perspective, shall we? So in 1974, think about it. This guy, Gerald Ford, was president. You could go and see the movie The Godfather Part 2 in theaters all across the country. You could get a gallon of gas for 55 cents a gallon. And I looked like this. That's me getting ready. It looks like for a friend's birthday party. They're pretty cute in 1974. I have to say so myself. But things have definitely changed for the worse since then for me. So Brad, you're going to kind of talk a little bit more about sort of different email, other than email, different strategies that have a great deal of influence with members of Congress in the decision-making process. Brad?
So thanks, Seth. So that's the context of really to wrap up this section and go to the next one, is that because, and this is happening at state capitals as well, because of the increased use of email as a way to try to influence legislative outcomes, email as a tool is diminished if it's a mass email. Now, we're not saying if you get an email from Joanna or from somebody else at the state office, asking you to send an email to the state legislator, do it. That they've clearly identified a action item that needs your attention. But as we've talked in previous programs, you're going to personalize, you're going to localize it. But what about those individual meetings when you actually get in the room, and how do you prepare for them? Well, first, let's jump with some data that we have from our research of congressional staff. We did a survey of congressional staff and asked them this question right here. If your member or senator has not arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And we asked, would have a lot of influence, some influence, or no influence at all. And at the top of the list, what you can see here as you look at everything, and we'll show you just the top answers, is that individualized emails makes a difference, but in-person visits from constituents and contacts from a constituent's representative. And that was defined in the survey as a representative from a business, an association, or a nonprofit in the district or state. I can also tell you in my conversations with state legislators, they answer the same way. I know there's this cynical view that politicians don't listen to their constituents, but I can tell you all the research and data, both from the academic community and from the Congressional Management Foundation, is that these meetings that you engage in and are going to be engaged in just a couple of months in March, whether virtual or in person, are really important, and really the things that the members of Congress and the state legislators are looking to move the needle. That's what they really want to get from you, is these in-person meetings. So what do they expect in meetings? Well, they expect what can you expect in these meetings? Well, what you can expect when you go to meet with a member of Congress or a state legislator is often the staff is very young. The average age of a House legislative assistant is 27 years old. Now, I was the chief of staff for a freshman lawmaker in the House, and I can tell you, it's the NFL of the legislatures. I mean, this is the best and the brightest. We had 16 openings, and 15 100 applications. And that's still the case on Capitol Hill, where they're getting hundreds, if not thousands, of applications for people wanting jobs up there. And I know if you're in a state legislator as well, it's a very sought after position. You also can sometimes expect to meet with staff, that you're not going to meet with the legislator, whether it's a state or US senator. And that's okay. They're building relationships with staff, as we've said in some of the previous programs, is one of the most important things that you can do as a better sort of advocacy 201 type of grass tops individual. You also, especially when they're in session, can expect the sessions to be brief. If you've not had these meetings when the Texas State Legislature is in session, remember, of course, it's a very time limited session. And so you are going to have a brief period of time. You also might be in some crowded spaces. These are not luxurious spaces. Or if you're doing a Zoom meeting, maybe with a staff member or even a member of Congress, they're not going to have the most glorious background. So don't have high expectations there. And especially when they're in session and they're voting, expect distractions and interruptions, phone calls, other things that could be interfere with your ability, which means your focus, your rehearsing, your practice, your capability to deliver a message succinctly in a short period of time is important. So what does that mean? It means preparation is actually one of the key components of having successful meetings, is not waiting until the last minute. And Seth is going to walk you through some of the different things and some of our research on preparing for meetings with state legislators and with members of Congress. Seth?
Thanks, Brad. So yeah, preparing for meetings, it's just critical to take the time to do the prep work. It's 9/10 of it is it's all in the preparation, and we unfortunately know that a lot of constituents, when they have meetings with their members of Congress, frankly, they kind of fall down on the job in doing that. And here's the research that shows us this. One is, so we asked this question of congressional staff. My computer just glitched out on me. We asked this question of congressional staff, the question of, in your opinion, how prepared is the typical constituent before they meet with a member of Congress? I apologize for what's happening with my PowerPoint there. We'll try to get that presentation back
Seth,
up.
why don't you let me pick up here, and you can
sure, and I'll get it back going on the screen. Thanks,
yeah, you start doing. So what we asked was, in your opinion, how prepared is the typical constituent that you meet with? And what we found is only 12% of congressional staff would say that people were very prepared, which is obviously problematic when you look at how much work goes into the decision-making process. And so only 78% said they were somewhat prepared and could be better. And what that tells us is that tells us that people can do a lot better job if they actually do spend the time to prepare for meetings. And you can differentiate yourself from other people and other individuals if you do take time to prepare for these meetings. One chief of staff in our open-ended session said this: the lack of preparation for meetings is a real problem. It's disappointing when constituents and/or lobbyists come in for meetings and they are clueless about the congressman, the district, and committee assignments. So preparing for meetings is an essential part of having a successful meeting, and it differentiates you. It separates you from all the other people who might go into that state lawmaker's office and just read the talking points. That doesn't mean you don't want guidance from your state office and your national office, but you need to personalize it and localize it and understand how that member of Congress will play a constructive role. So know a little bit about them. So let me jump right into the meeting tips. Tip number one: communicate information that Congress wants from constituents. And what we mean here is avoid some of the things that are more robotic. There are some people that will come in and talk legislatees. It's a made up word. There's fortunately not a real word. And they think that they need to know about budget reconciliation and what cloture means and the difference between a markup and a hearing. And yeah, it's nice if you know those things, but it is absolutely not necessary for a productive and constructive meetings. What they want is something a little more clear. And what they're listening for is, we want this. This is a scene, by the way, from a movie on lobbyists. But what they want from you and what members want to know is, what actions do constituents want me to take? Why do they want me to do that? What are the current and/or potential local impacts? And finally, what are constituents' personal stories or connections to the policy. And for those of you that were in our last session where we talked about best practices in advocacy storytelling, that's where your role comes in to narrate an action or a legislative decision and how it's going to impact your customers, your company, your community in a very real way. And we gave you some examples of that. And if you need that recording, I know that Joanna can provide that if you didn't have a chance to see it. But that is one of the best things you can do. Moving up to the third bullet, what are the current and or potential local impacts? One of the things that we've learned in working with both the Texas Realtors and the national Realtors is your state and federal lobbyists do a phenomenal job of putting together these fact sheets that show potential local impacts. Use them, please. They are very valuable tools in communicating what's going on in your community and the impact on your industry. So that's going to really separate you out from a lot of other organizations and associations that don't either have the experience or resources to have you prepared. So what else are they looking for? Well, let's talk about what they get and what they don't get. This next series of data is from a survey we did of legislative assistants and legislative correspondents. But first, I want to play for you a clip from Jonas Shoemate. He's the chief of staff from the office of Representative Rick Crawford. And he talked a little bit about how it's important to personalize the message. So Seth, go ahead and run that clip.
Humanization of policy is always good because you get such an abstract idea about how something can be good or how it can be bad. But when you've had somebody who's actually experienced something in a very good way, it helps build, a compelling story and a narrative for keeping a policy or even getting rid of it. The negativity also has the same effect, that if something has been in effect for a long time or going on, there's unintended consequences that you just don't see that comes from just something being in existence. And so being able to humanize something is always a very positive thing.
So as Jonas said, that's from the horse's mouth. What they're looking for is some way to connect the policy and the decision that they're going to make to real people's lives. I think I use this example in one of my other presentations to you. I was doing a presentation to some medical professionals, and it was right after the Affordable Care Act had been passed. And a woman came up to me and said, well, this is how I explained it to my congressman. I said, Congressman, if you vote for this amendment, your constituents are going to have to drive farther and pay more money to get the same procedure they get today. And the congressman said, we're done. What's next? So sometimes it only takes that type of personalization. Doesn't take a lot to just explain the impact of a policy. Next, Seth is going to talk about tip number 2.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Thanks for covering for me when my computer decided to glitch out. I appreciate that. The next one is to do your homework. We know that unfortunately, a lot of people aren't prepared because we asked this question here. How frequently do you experience the following in meetings? And we're going to share a little bit more of this research later in the program. I just wanted to focus on 2 specific things here. And first, it's these 2 things right here. First is didn't know the members' relevant committee assignments. 78% of staff said that constituents frequently or somewhat frequently come into meetings and they haven't even bothered to do the most basic research, which is to figure out what the members' committee assignments are. And then here's this other one right here. Didn't know the members' history on the policy or issue. It's pretty embarrassing when you go in and you ask somebody, hey, can you co-sponsor a bill? And they have to answer, no, I can't co-sponsor that bill because we're the author of it. We introduced it. We can't co-sponsor our own legislation. So doing that research, this is some of the basic stuff. It's really important to make sure that you've done some basic research before you go into a meeting with a member, because otherwise you're likely going to kind of do something or say something that's going to indicate that you just haven't done some of the most basic kind of research. So first thing that we encourage folks to do when it comes to doing your homework and getting prepared is to develop a legislator profile. And so here are kind of 3 categories. The first thing is just the basic legislator profile, right? So you want to know their political party and whether or not they're a member of leadership. I talked about committees later before, and we'll go into that a little more deeply in a minute. And then also what their policy priorities are. Now, I'll tell you, I'll admit something. I had, when I did fly-ins, when I was with Goodwill Industries, I had one day where I did more than 10 meetings in one day, and I was absolutely punch drunk by the end of it. And in situations like that, I've walked into meetings and, just during the meeting, I couldn't remember whether or not this was a Republican or a Democrat. I'll give you a tip. Just look up at the TVs and see what is on. If it's MSNBC, you're in a Democrat's office. And if it's Fox News, you're in a Republican's office. I've actually had to use that as a tip in case you end up in that embarrassing situation as well. So that's kind of the basic stuff that you want to know. One thing though, is committees, right? We talked about that. And, committees are really important. They do a number of roles. One is they conduct oversight of the way programs and are being administered over the administration. They also, develop legislation, and they also then mark up legislation in the process. And really the key linchpin in the whole committee process is the committee chair. Committee chairs just are incredibly influential and powerful. As a matter of fact, I was doing some research looking at all the bills that were introduced in the last Congress, so the 115th Congress, and it was amazing. But 80% of the 5,000 bills that were introduced during that 2-year legislative period on Capitol Hill, 80% of it never made past the committee. And that's because that shows you the power of the committee chair. They also hire all the committee staff and the professionals that really help to draft all the legislation. They also have the ability to initiate drafts of legislation. So a lot of times, one of the best situations you can be in is to get a phone call from committee staff or personal staff, of a member or the chair who is on that committee to say, hey, we're developing some new legislation on flood insurance. What do you think about that? We'd love to get you to provide us some from legislative specs of things that we might want to make sure that we include in that legislation. And then also, as amendments come up, they negotiate those amendments. And what ends up out of that whole process is something that's called the chairman's mark. It's literally when they've gone through during a markup and they've taken pen to paper and they've struck out certain sections and words, and they've added new amendments to it, and afterwards the chairman's mark comes out, and that's the process. Now, to just kind of give you an illustration of the power of one particular committee chair, we're going to kind of do just sort of a highlight the experience of one particular member of Congress, and that is the late Senator Robert Byrd. Now, just up front, I'll just say that Robert Byrd had definitely a bit of a colored past, especially when it came to his record with civil rights. However, as a legislator, he was a very, very effective senator. He actually is the longest serving senator in U.S. history. He served as a senator from 1959 through 2010. He did something really interesting. He was a Democratic leader in 1997 through 1989, but he gave up that really important and influential position in leadership to take over the chair of the Appropriations Committee. He served as the chair of the Appropriations Committee from 1989 through 2009 when he passed away. And when he took over the gavel of the Appropriations Committee, he pledged to secure $1 billion for West Virginia. He actually achieved that goal and then went on to serve in office for more than 10 years. So, if you are from West Virginia, if you've ever visited West Virginia, you can't throw a rock in any direction without hitting a Robert C. Byrd Memorial something or other, right? You see some things like the Robert C. Byrd Memorial Appalachian Highway, or, looks like a road stop there, or the Robert C. Byrd Center for Legislative Studies, or the Robert C. Byrd Center for Rural Health. You get the idea. Because Robert C. Byrd brought in so much money as the appropriations chair, the people of West Virginia had a great deal of power in that part of the process. But then, Senator Byrd, he passed away in 2009. And what happened? Well, Barbara Mikulski took over from Maryland. And so that's why you see the Barbara Mikulski Memorial NASA Center and Center for Intelligence and things like that. And of course, then there was an election. Barbara Mikulski was no longer chair and Thad Cochran took over, and the people of Mississippi had a great deal more power. When power shifts in Washington, that also means that power shifts in the advocacy network. And so it's really important, especially if you happen to be, in a district where somebody is the chair or is even a member of that committee. It's important to know that, because you're in a really important position to influence that. You're in that position where a lot of other people are not. If there's that bill that's not going to make it to the 80, through that 80% rate where they don't make it through, that you might be able to actually influence that and get that bill moved through the process and get some consideration by the committee. Tip number 3 is this one here, and it's important to tune your pitch, to kind of adjust your pitch to kind of match some of the thinking, to resonate with the lawmaker. Actually, one congressional staffer put it really well. He said, one of the biggest mistakes in not customizing their pitch to our office that constituents make is not customizing their pitch to our office. We're a conservative Republican office, so the argument should be adjusted to appeal to that philosophical view. So, I don't know if that's not a testament to why it's important to tune your pitch. I don't know what is. So, we talked about profiling again. So let's kind of revisit that. We already talked about some of the basic things that you can do in the political and policy priorities, things like, you want to be informed about the member's record, things like that. But here's some other things that you can do to kind of make sure that you tune your pitch. So the policy priorities, that's something to really important to think about, because if you know what their policy record is and what their positions are, you can kind of think about tuning your pitch in that direction. I think about it this way. When I worked for Goodwill, if I was to go into a member's office that was a really kind of fiscal conservative member, I would go in there and I would say, last year, you may know us for all those stores. Last year, we raised $5.4 billion in all of our retail stores and other businesses in order to supplement federal investments in job training. But if I went into a much more liberal member of Congress, I'd probably start off with talking about some of the programs and maybe some stories about the people that we helped, framing that conversation very differently and up front to resonate with the lawmakers' positions, but still having a similar conversation and getting to that ask. Another thing to think about, though, is their personal profile. So you can also dig in to think about, what religion are they? What schools did they attend? Or what profession did they have before they came to Congress? These are things that can help you to also think about, like, what are their interests, but also, some people that you may have in common. And you don't have to stop there. You can also think about, do some research on their, what relationships they have, people that they hang, in their circles, key staff, their spouse, relatives, peers, things like that. But what I will tell you is, if you don't have a lot of time, if you only have 5 minutes before a meeting, this is what you need to know. Make sure that you've at least done this basic stuff. And what's really nice to know, you'll have a lot more leverage and more kind of options at your disposal if you've also done some research beyond just the basic kind of legislator profile stuff. I know that, having to do this, it can be really arduous. Oh God, you have to go back and do all this kind of research. But there's this new thing that came around a few years ago called Google. It's actually a pretty useful tool, and you can find a lot out just by doing a simple Google search. And if you have only 5 minutes and it's a choice between doing no research or just doing a fast Google search, I definitely recommend that you do that. Now, there are a lot of other places that you can get really great information as well. National Association of Realtors or the Texas Association of Realtors can give you state information. They have subscriptions to give you all that information, and they'd love to hear from you in advance of that. So why is it, though, that you're doing all this research? Well, there are kind of 2 reasons that you're doing all this research. The first reason is because you want to figure out a way for you to be able to connect the dots between you and your legislator. There may be people that you have in common, or people that are in your professional network that have really strong connections to that member, and to be able to leverage that relationship that they already have can be really important. And another reason is because you want to be able to connect the dots between what you care about and what your legislator cares about. And just to kind of illustrate this point, I'm going to tell you a story about this particular member of Congress right here. This is Senator Sherrod Brown. He represents Ohio. And Sherrod Brown does something quite interesting, and he does something different than most members of Congress do. He actually wears, instead of an American flag on his lapel, he wears this pin right here. It's a pin that's got a bird in a cage, and more specifically, it's a canary in a cage. If any of you are familiar with the expression "a canary in a coal mine," you'll know that it's not only is it a really good police song by the Police, one of my favorite bands from when I was growing up, but it's also a method that coal miners used to use. They would send a canary down into the coal mines, and if the canary survived being down in the coal mines for a certain amount of time, they knew that the air was safe to breathe, and if it wasn't, then it wasn't safe to breathe. So, but the reason that he wears this lapel pin is because his grandfather worked for the Public Health Service, and specifically actually worked with coal miners who suffered from black lung disease. And so in sort of solidarity to that, because obviously, you know, Ohio also has coal mines in the eastern area, he wears that lapel pin. So I was doing a training for some professionals that were preventive health medicine people. If you happen to be a preventive health medicine person and you live in the state of Ohio, that's really good information to know before you go into a meeting with Sherrod Brown, that he feels that strongly about a disease like black lung disease. So now we're going to talk about different things. So Brad talked about you know, the information that they need, and I talked about some of the research. So when you're going into a meeting, here's kind of, I'm just going to pull it all together for you. So first thing, you want to figure out a way to make your connection. You have done that research. You can connect your issue to the things that they care about. You also want to go in there and be able to provide information about the impact that the bill would have on the district or state. You want to be prepared to relay a personal story about the issue, and then also to provide your reasoning, not the policy wonk reasoning from, you know, the lobbyists, but your specific reasoning as a constituent about why it is that you personally care about this issue. And then, of course, you want to be able to deliver your ask. But, you know, we used to deliver this slide quite a bit, and then it occurred to me that there's something missing that's really critical to this slide. So think about what do you think is missing here? And I'll give it to you. It's this. A lot of people, I've actually sat through meetings with constituents when I was at Goodwill, and people go into their meetings kind of loaded for bear with their talking points. They go in there, they deliver those talking points, and then they leave. And they forget to listen to the staff people or the member that they meet with. And that is not a dialogue. That's not a conversation. And that's not what creates a relationship, is talking at somebody. It's having that dialogue that actually helps you to build a relationship. And it helps staff to, and members of Congress also to, you know, feel like, you know, what they have to provide to you also really matters. And so it's really important. Just don't forget to listen. And just so many people do. Brad's I'm going to hand it back over to Brad, who's going to talk to you about leave behind materials.
Thanks, Seth. So one of the things that I said earlier that you have as an advantage is you've got a great staff that can help prepare leave behind materials. And first, let me share with you some research that demonstrates that your materials are probably a lot better than everybody else's. We did a survey of congressional chiefs of staff, and we asked them whether they agreed or disagreed with this statement right here. Most of the written materials left behind by constituent groups as part of an organized fly-in or lobby day are helpful to our policy decision-making process. And only 37% of congressional chiefs of staff would agree with that statement. And looking at the materials that's left at the state level, I would have to say that's equally, if not even more true, because many state lobbying organizations don't have the resources that either the National Association of Realtors or the Texas Realtors have available. So you've already, again, differentiating yourself. How can you do that even more? How can you make those materials even more sexy, even more sticky in the minds of the staff and the state legislators you're meeting with? Well, we asked a question, again, of congressional chiefs of staff that went like this. When meeting with a group of constituents as part of an organized fly-in or lobby day, please indicate the helpfulness of the following written material. And what we found is that a leave behind of 1 to 2 pages, 94% of senior congressional staff would say that is very or somewhat helpful, but not very helpful was anything more than 5 pages. So anything you leave, please keep in mind. And I know the Texas and the National Realtors aren't going to arm you with additional stuff, but don't lord up, don't add a lot more to whatever you're delivering to your state or federal lawmakers. One congressional staff member said it like this: please do not bring me glossy folders with tons of background information. It's going to go right into the recycle bin. Now, let me offer one tip on your leave behinds. In fact, one of the things that we say at the Congressional Management Foundation is don't think leave behind, think read ahead. Meaning, if you've got a handout that you're going to be delivering, it could be something that either you've created or the Texas Realtors have created, and you actually have that in a PDF or Word document format, and you've got your meeting set up with your state lawmaker, go ahead and email them in advance. And here are a couple of the advantages of sending an email as an attachment in advance. And you may be sending it to their scheduler or their aide or whoever. A couple of advantages. Number one, they're going to be much more prepared for the meeting. Number two, they're going to deeply appreciate that you're not going to surprise them with something, which frankly, believe it or not, some constituent groups do. They like to play gotcha with their federal and state lawmakers. And guess what? You don't win that game. The federal lawmaker or the state lawmaker wins. And finally, they may have an answer for you at the meeting. Often when you go to meetings, with a state or federal lawmaker and you ask them perhaps to co-sponsor a piece of legislation, they'll say, well, let me think about it some and do some research, and I'll let you know in a couple of weeks. And they may or may not let you know. But if you send a read ahead a day or two in advance. And by the way, don't make it more than a day or two. Do it just like 24 to 48 hours, especially when the state legislature is in session. They're going to be really super busy. But if you send it 24 to 48 hours, you once again are going to differentiate yourself from other people that aren't providing that same degree of assistance. The fifth tip we want to give you for meeting prep is plan your follow-up. Now, that sounds a little weird, right? You haven't had the meeting yet. You still are getting your prep materials. Why would you plan your follow-up? Well, here's why. A lot of people don't engage in what we see here in this graphic, the follow-through. When I was doing my golfing lessons before I had children, because that is what screws up any good golfer's game, is having kids. This was something I always had trouble with, is getting that wedge to go way behind, your elbow up in the right position. That's something I just always used to miss on. And what we found in talking to congressional staff is that a lot of constituents miss that as well. One of the questions we asked a congressional staff member is this: do constituents or their organization generally follow up with you in a manner that is helpful and timely? And what we found, unfortunately, is only 1 out of 8, 15% of congressional staff said, yes, they got timely and helpful. The other 85%, they were missing one of the mark. It either wasn't timely or it wasn't helpful, or 4 out of 10 staffers just simply said no. And I'm sure at the state level, it's very similar. So what sort of tips are we providing you to prepare for your follow-up? Well, first, just block out on your calendar sometime you're going to do a follow-up. I mean, you want to get something done in your industry, in your business, you're going to block time to prepare a home or think about what your schedule is going to be in a given day and figure out your route. Well, it's the same when you're engaged in advocacy. One efficiency expert said it this way: that which gets scheduled gets done. And so block out some time on your calendar. Second, maybe recruit a colleague that might be also participating in the March fly-in with you to plan together. And that way you can share and bounce ideas off each other. Think about drafting the thank you communications in advance, and think about how you're going to be using email and social media to send communications to that state or federal lawmaker or that congressional staffer. Because especially social media, if you plan ahead, it's going to prompt you to, let's say you're in that Zoom meeting with that state lawmaker and say, hey, by the way, can I get a screenshot, or can I bring up my iPhone and take a picture of my screen that I can put on Twitter saying, hey, look at this cool meeting I had on Zoom with my state senator. That's okay. But if you don't plan in advance, if you don't know you're going to use that social media avenue afterwards, you probably won't be ready for that particular moment. Number 4 is consider how you can get the staff to ask, can you send me that? If you're showing someone, let's say you haven't done the read ahead or you don't have the leave behind in electronic format, what you want to do is deliver it to that staff member or that legislator, usually in electronic format. Now, not all people live in electronic files. Some people live in paper files, and you obviously want to deliver it to that politician or that staffer in whatever format they request. But more and more these days, people are looking to a paperless environment. They're looking for something that's an electronic format. A couple of years ago, I was doing some research on emails to Congress, and I asked a friend of mine who was a legislative director for a California lawmaker if I could just literally come over and look over his shoulder and look at how he organized his Outlook. And as I did that, I saw he had a subdirectory called important. And I'm like, ooh, what's in there? And he said, That's files that people send me before and after meetings that I know I'm going to need to refer to when we have to vote on their issue. That's what happens to electronic files. If they're good talking points, if they're good background information, they will save them. So consider how you can get the staff member to ask them to send it to you. And number 5, consider future district events. We all know that hopefully we're on schedule as a nation to start getting back to normal with a coronavirus vaccine by at least the end of the second quarter, if not going into the third quarter of 2021. Okay, if you've got a March meeting with a state lawmaker, what are you going to do in July or August? Is the issue still going to be hot? If you have a federal meeting with a member of Congress or a senator, is there a district visit or state visit in the future that you want to prompt them for? And by doing that, when you're in the meeting, you can actually do the ask there. And you say, hey, I know everything's all locked down right now, but perhaps when we finally start to open up, you could come do a site visit to this area that is often hit by floodplains and talk about flood insurance and why important for renewing that at the federal level. So think about those activities that you can engage in real life down the road. I assure you, members of Congress and staff, especially, are looking to get out of their offices and out of their home offices and back into sort of the press the flesh retail level of politics and government. And so there's going to be a real appetite for that in the second half of 2021. Think about that as you're planning your follow-up. Next, Seth is going to walk you through the last section about research on meetings and what work and what doesn't work. Actually, Seth, let me handle this one because actually I just realized this was the research that I designed, so I'm probably in a better position to talk about it.
Sounds great.
So this is a study that we did with congressional staff that was really terrific and yielded a lot better results than we anticipated. We, for the first time, actually pulled aside the staff members involved in policy decision making. So these are people that are in the meetings with senators and House members and House representatives. And we basically listed a bunch of things that happen in the meeting, some good things and bad things. And the question we asked that gave us some data went like this: how frequently do you experience the following in constituent meetings? And this is what we found is in the category of very frequently or somewhat frequently, we got things like constituents were rude in the meeting, or at 55% didn't tell a personal story, or at 78% say frequently or somewhat frequently they didn't know the members' committee assignments, as Seth talked about earlier about doing your research in advance. You can differentiate yourself from 8 out of 10 meetings if you simply know the state legislators' committee assignments. And at 81%, what we found is they were unspecific with their request or action. So that's probably not going to be your case. One staffer said it like this: the more specific the ask, the better. Also, when coming in, be informed about the member's record. Frequently, constituent groups come to DC meetings asking for the member to take an action he's already taken. Okay, I think we kind of hammered on that point too much. Last set of data in the sequence, 84% of congressional staff responding to this survey said they bring in too many talking points. 2 or 3 is all you really want. 85% said that there were too many participants in the meeting. That may not be as an issue in Austin, but it sometimes can be. So be mindful that they don't have big conference rooms and they may ask you to meet in a hallway at the state legislator or at the federal legislator. And our top answers of what they saw frequently and very frequently, at 87%, they didn't know the member's history of the issue. At 90%, frequently or very frequently, congressional staff said they didn't have data on the impact. Again, having those leave behinds from the state and federal lawmakers really differentiates you from other meetings that they have. And the top answer at 95% was they didn't understand the negative consequences. And when we explore what that meant is they didn't understand that voting with them or supporting them would have negative consequences on the legislator and their politics. So demonstrating empathy is really one of those things that separates you. I remember showing this chart when I first developed it a few years ago to a lobbyist friend of mine, and he said, "You're going to put me out of business because this is what I tell people to do. This is what I train people to do." Okay, lastly, before we take questions, Seth and I are going to go through the top 10 tips when meeting with Congress or a state legislator. And some of this is all going to be a summary of what we've already delivered, but this is a good top 10 list. Seth will cover the first 5, I'll cover the second 5. Seth?
Thanks, Brad. So let's just cover those top 10 tips. So tip number one is you want to be clear on the goal. As the cliche goes, if you don't know where it is that you're going, any road will get you there. That's not the way you want to approach a meeting with a state legislator. You want to go in with a clear idea about what it is that you want to get out of that meeting, and keep focused on to exactly that. Know who you're talking to. I think that we've hammered on that one plenty. You want to do the research, not only with the policymaker, but also doing a little bit of research about the staff that you may be meeting with. You also want to know your issues. You want to be able to talk about your issues, about how they impact the district and state, and have personal stories about that, and really be able to speak to the issue in a way that demonstrates that you're knowledgeable on it, that you're a resource on it, and that when that issue is relevant, and getting action, that they can turn to you to ask you questions for your opinion about what it is they may need to do as the issue develops. Next, I talked about this already. Connect your issue to the member's district or state, and then lastly, you got to make sure that you respect staff. I can't tell you, every flying event that I was ever involved in when I was at Goodwill, somebody, at least one person, would come up to me after kind of our training session. They'd get their schedule and they'd come up to me and they'd act really disappointed. And they'd say, I see my schedule here, but I'm only going to be meeting with staff. I thought I should be meeting with a member of Congress. And we showed that data point about almost 25% of congressional staff said that they experienced rudeness from constituents. I think that might be one of the things, is people go in there and they act so disappointed that they're going to just meet with staff and not the member, and they end up kind of being a little bit condescending and demonstrating that they're rude. And staff, frankly, they're really important people to know. In fact, they're the people that really need to be the experts on the policy issues. They have a lot more time to devote to being experts on your issues than the policymaker themselves. And so demonstrating and building a relationship with staff is incredibly important. And if you end up getting on the bad side of staff, I can guarantee you're going to end up having really difficult time generating a relationship with the policymaker themselves. So that covers the first 5, and Brad, you're going to cover the second.
Thanks, Seth. Number 6, keep it short. As you think about this abbreviated session that happens with the Texas State Legislature, you're only going to have a few minutes. They're going to be going in between hearings. They're going to be voting on the floor. They have other constituents waiting. So keep it short. And just to remind you, when you saw the example of the advocacy story that you heard in our last session in December, the example we showed you was about 3 minutes long. So if you actually do prepare and get ready, it doesn't have to be long. Number 7 is try to deliver the message in the first 5 minutes. They might get pulled away at a moment's notice. And the last thing you want to do is, after they left and you've got to go back and report to the Texas Realtors, well, we talked about UT football, but we didn't really have a chance to meet, and then he was gone. So you don't want to do that. You want to try to deliver your message in the first 5 minutes. Number 8, never go off message. I'll never forget this meeting I was in I was working for a U.S. senator, and this business group came in, and the first person speaking, there were 5 guys, and one of them said, well, I know we're supposed to talk about this business regulation, but I really want to talk about abortion. And we're like, oh boy. And that group never got an audience with the senator for the next 18 years when he was in office. So never go off message. We've talked about it before. Number 9, the less paper, the better. Use electronics, follow up, better yet, send the read ahead. And number 10, follow up ASAP. And we mean ASAP, within a couple of days. If you meet with a lawmaker at the state or federal level and ask them to take a particular action, and they say, let me look at it, that's okay. That's perfectly legitimate. You don't want to diss them. But a week later, no more than 2, send an email. I remember talking to one of my focus groups, a chief of staff said, I asked the question, who do you listen to? And he said, I hate to admit it, but I listen to squeaky wheels. Now, I'm not talking about people that call you 10 times a day. That's not a squeaky wheel. That's somebody who's needs some help. I'm talking about, the person who follows up a week or 2 later, the person that, runs into the lawmaker staff member at a Little League game and said, oh, you know what? I forgot to follow up with your boss. Is he going to co-sponsor that bill? I can't tell you the number of times that I get calls from the district office or from staff members. It wasn't often where the people had actually followed up. It makes a huge difference. With that, before we go to questions, we always like to leave with this quote, which hopefully you all have memorized now because we've used it at the end of every one of our sessions, from Thomas Jefferson, who said, "We in America do not have a government by the majority. We have a government by the majority who participate." So in the last few minutes, we're going to go ahead and turn on our video, and we'd be happy to take a few questions if we have any out there, Joanna, that people have put in through the chat or through the question box.
Brett, actually, I see right here that we had one question from Joe Stevens, who said, asked the question of, do you have any advice for FPCs working with newly elected congressional representatives? We just had an election and we've got a freshman class coming in. And as a matter of fact, we did some research in 2016, 2017, where we actually surveyed the freshman class of just the previous Congress.
19.
We had
19, it was just 2 years ago.
19, yeah. So we had the class came because it was such a large freshman class that we realized that's an opportunity to get a better sample size than you would normally have. And so we did do some research specifically on how to, what's the difference between meeting with members of, have long-term tenured members versus freshmen. I think one thing is there's a lot of people go in and they think to themselves, oh, I need to get in there and meet with the member right away. And it's important to keep in mind is, especially now with COVID, is that, members of Congress, they get the keys to the office on January 3rd, and then they have to start setting things up. That's not to say that they're not making preparations, but they aren't actually getting physical access to the building and that sort of thing until the 3rd. The member of Congress previous to them has access to their office up until around close to that moment. And so they're kind of building the plane while they're flying it. And so it's important, like they're working on trying to get people staffed up. They're trying to get their mail process in place. And so when constituents go out and reach out immediately and want to demand a meeting, that's not necessarily helpful. What would be more helpful would be to make a phone call or so in advance. You're probably going to be talking with a chief of staff, at least on Capitol Hill, and but whoever that person is, who's a new member, ask them, hey, I understand that you're brand new to the legislature or Congress, and we'd love to be able to meet with you on something on these issues. When the person is hired who's going to cover those issues, that would be the person you'd ask. I'd like to follow up with that person then, if that's helpful. And then follow up, make notes, follow up every few weeks and check in and see whether or not that person's been hired or not, and then connect with them. I know that new members really appreciate that when people do that in advance. Brad, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm actually doing a little experiment right now in real life. Is you can Google to find out who their senior staff is. So if you just type in their name and the title district director, you often will be able to find out who that person is. Like I was just doing it for, he's not a freshman anymore, he's a sophomore, but Dan Crenshaw of Texas. And I'm seeing a press release that he put out in January, announces senior staff. And so you can find, usually most lawmakers will put out press releases either from their campaign or from their official office announcing who their senior staff is. So just do a Google and just Google lawmaker's first name, last name, and just simply say district director or chief of staff, and you'll find those senior staff members. Most district directors and chiefs of staff have been hired now. What hasn't been hired are legislative assistants, and things are going a little bit slower. We obviously are in a very chaotic environment today with the, joint session of Congress. So things are definitely disrupted. And I don't know if you've heard the news of what's going on the Capitol a few miles from us, but it's even more chaotic than normal. And so give them a few days in the session in January to get their acts together. And then follow up with them maybe in February, March is another good tip.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us and being a part of our training the past few months. For y'all that are listening in, I hope that you're able to tie in all of this information that Brad and Seth have given to us, as well as the information that your staff at Texas Realtors or your local board will be providing for y'all, so that you guys can get started familiarizing yourself with the 2021 legislative priorities. We have a booklet that will be hard copy mailed to you, but you'll also be able to find it on our website at www.texasrealestate.com/issues. So you can view the PDF of our legislative priorities on there and start familiarizing yourself with that. And then next week, Wednesday the 13th at 11 a.m., Texas Realtors GA staff will be unpacking the information that we've learned the past few months, as well as giving y'all Texas Realtor specific information, just how things will go for Realtor Day, which we're looking to have expanded into a couple of weeks in March instead of all one day, since it will be virtually. So you'll get some information on that, and just understand that as a legislative contact team member, you'll have a lot more responsibilities this year going forward because of COVID, but also because we really want to elevate y'all as legislative contact team members. And just so y'all don't miss anything and stay up to date on how legislation is progressing through the state capitol, you can subscribe to our legislative liaison newsletter at texasrealestate.com/liaison, and then just check the box and click save. I mentioned this a few other times too. If you are not already a part of the Realtor Party mobile alerts, you can text the word TX Realtors, all one word, to 30644, and you'll receive updates and timely information on calls for action when we need your attention. I look forward to getting to work with y'all during the legislative session happening, and be on the lookout for my emails. Thank y'all so much for joining us today.